We now come on to our keynote speaker for this afternoon. Hallie, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I know you've got a very, very busy schedule. And over the next 45 minutes or so, we've got an opportunity. We're going to be looking at and delving into the five, which, considering the queue, a fair few have probably actually read this. So what we're hoping to do is, I've got a few questions that Hallie's very kindly agreed to actually answer for us. And then we want to really sort of open it up to questions from the audience, and an opportunity then over the course of, as I said, the 45 minutes, it's really just to explore some of the themes, the research and the planning that's gone into what has been a phenomenally successful book. So Hallie, you're more than welcome here at TMI History Icons.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great. Okay. No, I also wanted to thank you, and I wanted to thank all of you. Your history teachers are wonderful, first of all. I've often said I'm the daughter of a teacher, so I know where you're coming from. But your response to this book has been really extraordinary, and it has really warmed my heart, but it's really made me feel like the book has made an incredible impact because it's changing the story and it's changing the way you're teaching the story. So I wanted to give you my thanks as well as you thanking me. So it means a lot.
So many people looking at me. Right. Okay, I'm going to open it up straight away because our time is of the essence. So I'm going to say one really straightforward question to start off with. How did you begin to research the five? How did you begin the process?
Well, it's rather complicated, I would say, because well, I mean, every subject you research is complicated because there are all sorts of issues with the source material. The first thing I did was I read as much secondary material as I possibly could, and immediately was able to identify the major obstacle in this, which is so much of what was written about Jack the Ripper is from the perspective of an interest in identifying who the killer was, or doing something peripheral to that, such as an exploration of the policing at the time, often an exploration of, sometimes from a cultural, historical point of view, so looking at the media. But in terms of actual facts and in terms of, any sort of real close study of this material, that it didn't exist. And so what I found myself doing is kind of wading through all of this secondary material, a lot of it very spurious and a lot of it unfootnoted. And then I started doing what I would only describe as like peeling back layers of the onion, because I was looking for, well, if somebody is making that statement, or if we've always believed that, where is that coming from? And often that, I had to go all the way back to, quite often it was newspaper reports that I was finding and be able to identify it there. And then when I found that, then I hit this other layer, which is newspaper reports. And then suddenly I realized with newspaper reports, of course, you have syndication, you have variance in the way something is reported. And if it's a quote, often a quote from a witness will be said one way in one newspaper and written the other way in another newspaper. So then you have a question about, well, which is, when you don't have a definitive version, well, what is the definitive version? And then going one step further than that, which is what can we establish about the lives of these women from the actual records? So looking at birth and death records, workhouse records, army records, education records, I mean virtually anything I could get my hands on in an archive, which would give me a sense of where these...
Can I just ask, how far did you travel? How far did you have to go to find it?
Well, the furthest I traveled was Gothenburg, was Sweden, for Elizabeth Stride's story. And I went into the archive in Gothenburg with a Swedish speaker who had done a bit of research on Elizabeth Stride. And the most wonderfully gratifying thing about it was that he was always interested in Elizabeth Stride as almost on a kind of local historical level. But because he wasn't a historian, he didn't know...
Hallie, I'm so sorry. We're gonna.
You're gonna put me.
Is that okay?
Oh,
We'll
yeah.
swap these just so people can see. Andrew, you get
Sure.
on too. We got a full house.
Okay.
Oh, this is so much better. Oh. Hello at the back. Right.
So,
as you were saying.
Yeah. So I went into the archive in Gothenburg with this man who had explored Elizabeth Stride on a kind of local historical level before. And the interesting thing was, because he wasn't a historian, we went in together and he was able to show me, well, these are the police records, and we were looking through it, and it was amazing. But I said, well, wait a minute, what did you say that was again? Well, hang on, can we, that should be recorded somewhere else. And then as a result of that, this guy who'd been using this material for 10 years, we actually found other things on that day that he'd never seen. Because, so this, again, you know, like one of the things that I think I like to impress on people in general, and especially I know this message isn't going to go amiss in a room of history teachers, is that I think there's this mistake that history is not like a kind of skill set as much as, well, I've read a lot of books, therefore I'm a historian. And I think a lot of people don't realize it is a skill set. And if you don't have that skill set, it's very hard for you to be able to make the assessments that you make.
And did you find it the most challenging book for you to write in the end?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it was. I mean, each nonfiction book poses its own challenges, because it will be, if you are writing out of what comes out of the source material, and if the sources are sparse, then it's hard to write. But, you know, I think what surprised me in the first instance was this was the first book I wrote about the 19th century. I normally write about the 18th century, and you go back 100 years earlier and there's even less. So it was like, wow, all of this stuff, you know, and I can only imagine I'm starting a book that's where the events are based in the Edwardian era, and I'm already amazed by how much more information there is.
Thank you very much. So, following on from the process that you went through, what do you feel connects all of these women apart from the tragedy of their end?
Poverty, absolutely. You know, poverty, and the fact, and the way in which society actually regarded these women and treated them throughout their lives. So it was Victorian society and poverty that links them.
And did you find that over time your attitude to them, or the interpretation you had initially of them, changes as you found out more, you researched more? Oh,
it completely changed. I mean, I have to say that, you know, I'm slightly ashamed that I knew virtually nothing about these women when I started this work. And I know a lot of people who come to the book know virtually nothing about these women. And that, I think one of the things that's been so gratifying for me to see is to watch people go on exactly the same emotional journey that I went on writing the book in a much shorter time frame as they're reading the book. You know, everything from this like sense of discovery to this sense of anger also, and a sense of sadness. So now I can't remember, what did you originally ask?
I was just going to say, apart from one of the things that connects all five women, that was what I was really interested in.
Yeah, is there anything?
So poverty, first of all.
Poverty.
Was there anything else other than that you found started to make them seem very similar to one another, or were they very different?
They were all very different. They all had very unique lives, and that's actually what surprised me, was how unique their lives were and what individuals they were, that even amongst a class of you know, the Victorians looked very scornfully and very disdainfully at the poor. You know, we're not that far away from that attitude ourselves, and this idea that the poor, you know, their voices are not capable of being found in the record, or, you know, we just kind of throw away their experiences and we assume they're this just great mass, I think is really challenged by the fact that you can reach back and get this kind of almost random sample of 5 women and find that they all had very unique lives, though their lives were united by this tragedy of poverty and being a woman.
One of the things that comes back to is, and this was, again, some of these questions are not my own, they're accredited to some people that are in the audience, so please bear with that. One of the most fascinating questions I was coming back to time and time again when I was reading it was, what was the biggest surprise that you had while researching the 5? What was the big surprise? Did it ever come up to a point where you think, I didn't think my research was going to go in this direction? Well,
I think there were a lot of interesting things that jumped out. I mean, my proposal, as I wrote it up, was a proposal to write a book which was an investigation into the lives of 5 sex workers. And they weren't. And that was the biggest surprise for me, is that just that the body of evidence just wasn't there to support that, what I would call a myth. And that did really surprise me. But, you know, I think there were other things that I found, like my most amazing research moment with this was being able to uncover where it was that Annie Chapman went to rehab in one of the first women's alcohol rehabilitation centers in the 1880s in England, and actually finding the records in an Anglican convent in Wantage.
That's quite obscure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so coming back to this idea of the 5, which of the 5, and your book does look at it chronologically, doesn't it? Really is a focus on that. Which of the 5 do you think you identify with, and which one do you find that actually had little to no, you found very little research, you found most difficult to actually find out?
Well, I think that kind of touches on a question which is very, very interesting, relevant for all historical research, which is you can almost always find more about somebody who was of a slightly higher social rank. So Annie Chapman, I think, was fascinating for that reason. Annie Chapman, her family managed to claw themselves into the ranks of the lower middle classes. And because of that little bit, because of the proximity of their lives to wealthy people, to a prestigious regiment, the Household Cavalry, there were more records. And that's a really interesting thing. So, you know, the further you go up in society, the more records you're going to find, often is the case. And that was certainly the case with Annie Chapman. Not surprisingly, I found very little about Mary Jane Kelly, because Mary Jane Kelly, the 5th victim, we don't even know if her name was Mary Jane Kelly. So we're not able to ascertain even a birth record for her. The information that she gave people during her lifetime was almost certainly fabricated in part. Women of her profession, and she was a professional sex worker in the higher echelons, I might add, changed their names frequently. And despite all of the efforts that have been made, really since the day of her death, no one has ever been able to find a record for somebody called Mary Jane Kelly at any point in history that meets the description of she gave of herself. So that was rather frustrating.
So your book could have stopped at 4.
It could have, but it shouldn't. And also, you know, it's funny because, you know, there are fringe elements who I'm sure we'll talk about later who were, you know, very upset because the idea of, that's probably ripperologist now, isn't it? Jamming the broadcast. Who were saying, well, you know, you're not giving us anything new about Mary Jane Kelly, but I think, you know, your responsibility as a historian is, where there are no records, you must say there are no records. We cannot take this any further, or at least I can't, until something else changes. And that's part of what scholarship is.
So do you think if you went back into it now, after writing it and coming back to it maybe in maybe a year's time, you would be able to find more out?
Who knows? I mean, I think one of the greatest things that has happened with historical research has been digitization. Digitization has meant that all of these records are now available. So many more things are available. And I found that a lot of my research I could do via things like Ancestry. You know, it's so much easier to be able to cross-reference things. So much stuff is put online, and it changes what we know about things because it makes it more accessible. And I think it's great for everybody because it means everybody has an opportunity to interact with documents, which is so important.
I'm going to take this opportunity now because I think it's appropriate just to open up to the floor a couple of questions. I've got a couple more to hold back, but is there... Alice, have you got a question?
Yes, I do. My question is, what inspired you to write
I think we've got a roving mic that's coming to you round the back.
What inspired you to write the book in the first place?
What inspired me to write the book in the first place? Well, I wanted to write a book about working class women. And I think I've had a frustration for a very long time in the amount of time that I've been writing books, which is I get very, very tired of the same subjects just getting oxygen and nothing else. And I mean, I'm sure we have lots of fans of the Tudors here, and lots of fans of the Second World War. And that's not to say that those subjects aren't interesting. I'm a historian, I find everything interesting. But we need to tell new stories, and especially we need to tell stories of people who don't normally get a look in, you know, marginalized peoples, you know, that's so important.
So do you think there's neglected bits of history that...
Oh my God, I think most of history is neglected, actually. And, you know, if I've managed to kind of wedge open the door a bit for more histories of marginalized people to come in, God, then... you know, that my job is done. But I think now I'm trying to remember. I'm going in all directions. Can you ask again what it was that you were?
The inspiration for the story.
The inspiration
to write about that subject.
Well, I wanted to write about working class women, and of course I had to make it viable commercially. And the way in which you get a publisher interested is you hang it on a peg of something that everybody knows about, and then I looked and I saw, oh my God, actually nobody's written about this, and then I knew I had to write about it.
Thank you, Alice. Another question. Yes.
At the time, have you got a favourite?
Have I got a favourite?
One of my questions.
Well, I feel like, I kind of feel like, you know, like a mother shouldn't choose favorites, but and I feel like each one of these women is different, and they've each had a very different experience, and I felt differently as I was writing each one of their life stories. And I mean, Annie Chapman, I felt a great deal for, because I think her story is one of the saddest, because her life, they were so close. They were so close, and then that backslide. And I mean, she needn't have even been out on the street that night as well. And that I felt really struck me very, very hard. But the interesting thing is looking at census records for example, who was staying in the lodging houses. I was looking in 1881, 1891. There's such a kind of a disparate mix of people who are staying in the lodging houses, who are effectively down and out, which is what staying in a lodging house would mean. So you have people who were middle class, like Annie Chapman, who fell in hard times, and as well as the kind of laborers, the unskilled laborers, and people like that. So, you know, it gave you an idea, you know, how few options people had who fell in on hard times, and how not unusual Annie Chapman's story actually is for the time.
And do you feel that she could have had that sort of network of friends that could have saved her?
Well, she had her sisters, you know, and the problem was, I mean, the real issue there is one which is an issue today, which is one of addiction. You know, this was a story as much about poverty as it was about addiction, and what addiction does and what addiction can do, and how it destroys families and it destroys lives. Because here was a person who, she could have been with her mother, she could have been with her sisters, but they were teetotal, and the disease that she had prevented her from being able to kick the habit entirely.
Well, right at the back there. I'm doing this on purpose.
You picked someone at the back.
Yeah.
We have someone right in the front as well. Okay.
There you go. Emily's
I just want to ask, so what would your next book be? What's your next piece of research, do you think?
The next book I'm writing is, well, first of all, I'm staying in historical true crime, because I think looking at true crime through a historical lens, and also flipping it and using it as a way in which we can examine a time period is another way in which we can consume true crime, which is, I think, ethical. So I'm doing it. My next book is about the Dr. Crippen murder of 1910, and which is an incredible story populated almost exclusively by women, with the exception of Dr. Crippen. And so it's an investigation of middle-class lives in really from about the 1880s until 1910, and about the group of women who were involved in effectively helping to apprehend Crippen, whose stories have been written out of the record. But also using this crime to give us an idea of what was happening at that time in history amongst that group of people. Thanks.
Well, hiya. So I was talking to a local teacher the other day who wants to have at least one lesson when she's teaching about Whitechapel on the reaction to this book, because I think it's fair to say at times it's been vitriolic.
Yes.
And I just wondered, why do you think the reaction to the book has, I mean, in this community, like, you're a superstar, but you could go on Twitter and see some very negative things about the process, the content, and I just wondered why you think people were so almost precious about that traditional narrative.
I think there are lots of reasons. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about it as well. And one of the things, I mean, there's a sense of ownership, and that, you know, as a kind of a topic within history to investigate is a really interesting historiographical issue. Who owns history? And I think for very long, for quite some time, look, it's the ripperologists again. Every time I start talking about them, that happens. I think that for a very long time, this kind of whole Jack the Ripper narrative has been the territory of what might be considered pseudo-history. And so it's beyond the pale of what, you know, ordinary historians have always turned their nose up on it. Oh, it's ridiculous, you know, it's like the Loch Ness Monster and UFOs and Bigfoot and that sort of thing. But I think actually these are the topics that historians have to address head on anyway, because, well, why is it that this topic has migrated in that direction? And I think what's happened is that these people, and they are mostly men and some women, you know, have seen it as their preserve. It allows them to carve out a certain expertise, which they then hinge their whole identity and self-confidence on, and it becomes a very, very personal issue. I think for a lot of people it underpins their understanding of the world, a certain degree of misogyny and sexism as well, which rides along with that. And I think they're just not willing to give the ownership of that topic up, because it has a massive impact on them personally and the people that they surround themselves with, who they consider their community.
I think that answers that question. Any further questions? Simon?
Just at the front.
Oh, there you go. I was wondering, did you think Victorian society pushed the five to Whitechapel, or Whitechapel dragged them in?
Well, that's an interesting question.
Thank you.
And I think the place where I should start with that is the mistaken belief, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of preaching to the converted here because a lot of you will know this. The mistaken belief that Whitechapel was the only sink of poverty in London. It wasn't. I mean, these pockets of poverty were equally distributed throughout the capital and everywhere else. Every other city had them. And then, of course, there was rural poverty. So this idea that if one was poor, one had to live in Whitechapel is, again, part of this legend that needs kind of debunking. Because, you know, in every community there are a mix of people, and, you know, it's important to say there were also middle-class people who lived in Whitechapel. There were the shop owners, the pawn shop brokers, you know, people like that. But Whitechapel did have a particular reputation for a really type of embedded, intractable type of poverty that, poverty that bred generation after generation of the poor. And I think it's just an accident, actually, that they ended up there. They could have ended up anywhere. I mean, Annie Chapman, I'm pretty sure, lived in Nottingdale, which was also, a pit of poverty. To a certain degree, parts of Westminster, where Kate Eddowes lived at one point, were very depressed. Bermondsey, Lambeth, all over London. So I think it's just a bit of bad luck, really, that they all ended up in Whitechapel. They could have been anywhere.
Thank you. Yes, Jen.
Were you surprised by the response to your book from history teachers? Or were you hoping to kind of aim to change curriculum?
I am totally thrilled by your response. I mean, I'm...
Can you repeat that, Andy? Sorry, the question, just so we can hear it.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Oh, right, okay. Jen, would you like to give your question?
I just couldn't hear it, sorry.
Sorry, I said, was Hallie surprised by the response from history teachers, or was she kind of aiming to change curriculum?
And I said I'm
Great
totally, completely thrilled, just over the moon, because I wasn't imagining it would have this sort of reach. And it's this response that has been, really, it gladdens my heart, as I say. And it's one of the things that when I'm at literary festivals and things like that, and people ask me, the kind of repercussions of your work, how are they felt? And what you're doing is the one thing that I hold up as being one of the greatest achievements of this book, which is to really, really be something that becomes a new way of teaching effectively old material, but changing the narrative and also speaking to younger generation and making them consider issues that perhaps hadn't been considered before, especially when it comes to teaching this material, but also history in general.
Thank you for the question. And one of the things that we've seen, and you can see it on social media, is that teachers, maybe even in front of us now, are actually writing lessons and scheme of work on your book, so which is phenomenal. I just want to open up any further questions. Alex, thank you.
Say, with it being International Women's Day tomorrow, and with you being Times bestseller, and we're in a height of the hashtag Me Too movement. Obviously, the reporting of these women are very much of a time, and I just want to know how we can use your book as a catalyst to make sure that these sort of media stereotypes and reporting bias can be countered.
Well, I think the book can help us to remember to always ask questions, especially about the portrayal of certain people, about knee-jerk responses to certain things that wind us up. I mean, I think social media is really useful, for example, in getting messages out. And, and if it weren't for social media, there probably wouldn't be, for example, a Me Too movement. But, it's also got a flip side and a darker side, which are, dog piles and all sorts of negativity that comes out of it. And so, I think we can look at, for example, the way the Victorians handled this story and how the media reinforced their belief sets, and look at how the story was shaped around their own beliefs, and then be very aware of our own beliefs, and just always to question, always think laterally, think out of the box, and encourage your students to always question.
Great. Thank you very much for your question. One of the things that comes back time and time again when reading the narratives is that, did you find at any point that you had to stop when writing the book? Was there any moments of pause, or did you find actually it was a very difficult, any setbacks you found?
Oh my gosh, this was such an emotionally difficult book to write. I think it was, and again, I think, for me, what's been so fascinating is to watch, to see, and to listen to people talk about their emotional responses as they've been reading the book, and it goes from, oh my God, this shock and surprise, and I didn't know this, and this is incredible, to this sort of anger and sadness. And now imagine experiencing that over the course of about 3 years. very in super slow motion, which was me. That's what I was experiencing. And there were times when I would get so angry, I would just have to walk away. And especially, I think a lot of times what triggered that was if I was looking for information about something specifically, and then I just come up against this wall of writing about Jack the Ripper and the language used and the focus on, well, you know, how was she slashed and how was she ripped up, and look, you know, I'm looking for information about her life, and all I can find is what part of her internal organs were taken out. And then that made me so angry. And it was times like that when I thought, you know, I've just got to back off here as well and take a couple of deep breaths and do some mindfulness.
Okay. I mean, there's also this whole tourist aspect around surrounding this. I mean, I went to London, had a chance to, I didn't go, but there was lots of these excursions that you could go and you could follow the routes and things like that. How does that make you feel now? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is I never, there were moments where I was on the brink of going on a Ripper tour and moments when I was on the brink of going to the Jack the Ripper Museum, and I always pulled back because I couldn't trust myself to behave myself. And I thought that, you know, this isn't going to be good for anyone. And yeah, I mean, there is a Ripper industry, and I mean, the interesting thing is to put it all in perspective. There was a Ripper industry after the first killing, because people would go in on tours and there was, you know, merchandise that was sold, there were waxworks, there were all sorts of things. So that industry has been there. And while I'm not the sort of person who would set out to say, let's abolish this, it's terrible. Of course I disagree with it, but there are other ways to counter that. And information is a great way to counter that. And I think when people meet these 5 women, they might think twice about maybe wanting to go on a Ripper tour, because, you know, some of them really glorify the murder. Some of the Ripper tours are actually really well balanced, and they talk more about the women, and it's more focused on their experiences and that sort of thing. But I would never advocate abolishing something, because I think that's wrong. You know, if you want information, you can get information.
Thank you. Got a flood of hands. Any other questions? Scott?
So, just regarding that, over the past couple of weeks there's been a lot of work in the local community, like the local council have, you've got your sort of promotional painting on the side of a building, and they said that they're going to put up a permanent kind of memorial. And I saw yesterday or the day before that one of the churches now has a memorial plaque.
Yeah.
Do you think that is going to change the local narrative of what's going on? And it sort of relates to Will's point, and also, of course, to the Ripper tour thing.
Yeah.
You say not abolish, but what do you hope might happen from this, and how might it work?
That there will be a balance that will come in, and I think, you know, what we're talking about is basically turning a juggernaut around. It's very hard to change public opinion, though public opinion can change quickly, and I think the more this part of the story becomes part of our cultural understanding of what the Ripper murders were, people will make choices to do things. They'll make choices to include the women in depictions of things. They might decide that this is distasteful and not want to participate in it. And I think one of the things that I would certainly, I hope to do with the mural is, it seems completely right and fair to have these women's faces right in the center of Whitechapel, to remember them, to commemorate them in that way, because so much money and time and energy and thought is being thrown into Jack the Ripper and immortalizing him. You know, the least we can do is bring the women front and center into this as well, because otherwise they're just pawns in a game, you know, and people forget that they're real people.
So bringing them from the background into the foreground.
Yes, from bringing them, exactly.
Okay, any further questions? Ben.
Have you come across anything? Have you come across any equivalent or similar or parallel sort of issues? compared to the issue of the five, is there a, I don't know, is there a German version of it, or is there another story that you think is similarly? Because I was just thinking as you were talking about liberating these people, there's a part of me also thinking that in some of our history curricula, sort of people like the soldiers in the front line in the First World War, or in fact, the millions who live in poverty, and it's not just these five, is it? They
Exactly.
there's also a tendency sometimes to focus on the lurid aspects of sort of the urbanization and in the industrial period. I was just wondering if you'd come across any other areas.
Well, I think there are a lot of areas that are in need of, and I would say revisionism, but revisionism as in not going in. The danger with revisionism is people think, oh no, you're going in with an agenda and your agenda is X, Y, or Z, whatever. But more about kind of more keenly focusing in on, well, what do we know? What is the history? Look, there again, every time we talk about this.
Of course.
Okay. Oh, I think, are we okay?
good?
Oh, I think can we, oh yeah, okay, that works. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think, I mean, one of the things I'm aware of is, there are different types of history that are kind of in circulation. I mean, there's academic history, which I think not so many people read, not so many people get to access. Then there is a kind of public history, a well-known history, which seems to focus on a number of very key touch points, such as the Second World War, the Tudors, and often these are attached to things like, for example, one of my soapbox issues is Jane Austen. It's the way the Georgian period is depicted. You have one person who gets to tell you all about the Georgian period, and that's Jane Austen, and that is such a disproportionate depiction of life at that time, and also, like with the Second World War, often it's all about us as the victors, it's all about Churchill, it's all about this. There are so many other narratives, and we have to stop shying away from that. And I mean, the Second World War in particular has really been utilized and almost weaponized against us. And I think our job as historians in the future is to kind of put up our hands and say, look how you're using this material. There are other ways of telling these stories. There are other aspects of this that we're not examining. And here they are, right under your nose. And I think that's somewhere to start. And I do hope other authors start taking similar approaches to how I've approached this particular topic.
That's me. Okay. I just wondered if you'd had the opportunity to actually go and visit a classroom or been in a history classroom of late to talk about this. And I'm sure there's a fair few people who will go, no, but I really would.
Yeah, I mean, am I on? Yeah, I am on. Am I on? With a bit of interference. No, okay. No. If it starts going funny, I'll just grab yours. Yes, I do a lot of school visits, and it has been really amazing. And one of the things that surprises me is that I visited actually recently a couple of girls' schools, and they are. This book seems to really touch a sort of YA readership, and I hadn't anticipated that. It really speaks to teenage girls in particular, really, really getting into this book, and I hadn't envisaged that market at all. But it has been wonderful going to schools. I do make school visits. I do charge to make school visits. If that is something you're interested in, I'm not
I would.
Yeah, I'm gonna plug. I'm gonna plug. I realize that some of you will have larger budgets than others. Do contact my literary agent because they handle my school visits. And you will see it on my website. If you go into the contact page, there will be a little link to who you should send an inquiry to.
Thank you. I'm just going to wrap it up. I've got time for a couple more questions just before Hallie has to go. So is there any other question you'd like to ask at all? Okay, thank you very much.
I just wondered in the process of your research whether there are any other individuals that you came across that really kind of stood out to you, apart from the 5 women, whether there's anyone kind of that really drew your attention in the process of reaching and researching these 5?
Oh my gosh. I mean, in general, I mean, I'm literally overwhelmed by the amount of stories that haven't been told. And not just these women, but I mean, just across the board. I think we are so limited in, you know, the histories we tell. You know, it annoys me how few histories of people of color are on the shelves of women. And also, again, you know, somebody raised something the other day, actually was on social media, and it is absolutely, I agree with this, which is there is this kind of desire, in order to kind of redress this balance, to always hunt down, you know, the great women of history. But actually in doing that, we're doing exactly this. We're defining history within that narrow sphere, which, and something I deeply am opposed to, which is history should not be the great deeds of great men. History is the story of everyone. And the way in which we are going to get people excited, and the way in which we are going to get kids excited about this, is to say, you know, that person who lived 200 years ago, actually they lived and breathed and felt just like you did. But they had different set of circumstances. So let's start on that very keenly human experience of history. And in order to do that, we have to tell ordinary people's stories. We have to. Otherwise, history will always be dry and dusty and for white men.
I was going to do one last question, but I think that's a perfect way to end. I would like to give you the opportunity, on behalf of all of us, saying thank you so much for coming today, and a big round of applause. Thank you so much.